Good morning, everyone. My name is John Murphy. I represent the members of the United Association of Plumbers, Pipe Fitters, and Sprinkler Fitters in the state of New York. And I also sit on the executive boards of the New York State AFL-CIO, the New York State Building and Construction Trades Council, and lead the Clean Energy Jobs Coalition, New York. Collectively, we speak on behalf of thousands of skilled workers in the energy field who want to help create a smooth transition to cleaner energy for New York while protecting jobs and maintaining reliability for customers. We're so pleased we have some key energy players on this webinar today to discuss the challenges and potential solutions that lie ahead for this energy transition. Now, I'll be back to speak a little later, but for now, I'd like to turn this over to a person many of you may know who will be our moderator for this webinar, and that's former WCBS News Radio 88 reporter, Peter Haskell. Peter, take it away.
All right, thanks, China. Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of you who registered for the webinar. Thank you. The Clean Energy Jobs Coalition in New York plans to hold other webinars on energy issues in the coming weeks. There are many different aspects of the clean energy transition underway, and today we want to focus on energy supplies. How much more electricity the states will need to generate in future years as we begin to electrify everything, from heating systems to cars to stoves. We're going to hear about the plans to fill the supply gaps, as well as new clean alternatives to electricity. Now, in addition to John, joining us today are Gavin Donahue. He represents the Independent Power Producers of New York, and Jay Egg, the president of EGGEA. First up is Kevin Lanahan of the New York Independent System Operator. The NISO is the state's grid operator. It's responsible for overseeing the transmission of electricity to utilities throughout our state, assessing electric reliability needs now and in the future, and running the wholesale market where electricity is bought and sold every day. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you today and talk about this important issue. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I appreciate that introduction of the New York Independent System Operator too, because not everybody knows who we are and what we do, but it is critical to this great energy transition in New York State today. The picture on this next slide is of the control room, which is located in Rensselaer, New York, where we operate the nerve center, the backbone of the high voltage transmission system and the wholesale electric markets. We have about 600 employees here in the building that work across various different departments, operations and planning and market design. We're going to focus on what folks are doing in the planning department at the New York Independent System Operator, because as was mentioned, the reliability reports that we're putting out these days show what it's going to take to keep the system reliable as we go through this great transition. I just want to cover quickly four principles under which we operate. We talk about maintaining reliability. That is always job one at the New York Independent System Operator. We operate and administer open, fair, wholesale electric markets, making sure that the many hundreds of market participants operating in the wholesale markets do so according to the rules, that the markets operate at the lowest cost possible to consumers and are fair and transparent. Additionally, as I mentioned, we are constantly analyzing data and information that we're getting from various different resources, the utilities themselves, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, for instance, analyzing the economy and the changes to understand how the system is responding and reacting to the policy mandates and what investment needs are necessary in order to keep the system reliable on a going forward basis. Our planning engineers are constantly analyzing that information on a 2, 10, and 20-year time horizon. That 20-year time horizon is something relatively new pursuant to the CLCPA and the state decarbonization mandates. So what are the themes of some of these reliability reports that we're putting out, and what is the data telling us? As I mentioned, we're constantly poring over that data, and it's our obligation, it's our job to make sure that that information gets in the hands of policymakers so that they can continue to make the best informed decisions about the system going forward. We are definitely seeing a more dynamic, flexible electric system. We are seeing more and more renewable generation connecting, but we are beginning to see a bit of an imbalance between retirements of traditional resources. These are the fossil fuel units that we've relied on for reliability for several decades, beginning to leave the system and divest and retire. That's pursuant to state policies. So in one way, that is working. But we're seeing a bit of an imbalance in terms of the generation coming in, new technology connecting to the system necessary to keep the system reliable. And we've got to maintain that balance, and we must keep our eye on the development and the progress made to getting to our investment goals, or we could find ourselves in a reliability situation in the next few years. Why is this happening? Well, electrification adoption is definitely ramping up. We are seeing surprising amounts of accommodation and adoption of new technology like heat pumps and EV vehicles, especially in the city and the downstate area, than we expected. In addition, we're seeing forecasted load increasing across the state. In upstate New York, especially, we are seeing data centers and cloud computing centers beginning to site or ramp up their facilities, and that's looking like increased load. And we're going to have to build more transmission from upstate to downstate to deliver the emissions-free resources that we're expecting to site there, but then also to deliver the emission-free resources that are already sited and operating in upstate New York. We have a lot of hydro in upstate. We have a lot of nuclear. These are emissions-free resources. And of course, we have a lot of wind, and we're expecting more. In order to serve the needs going forward, we are going to have to continue to build loads of transmission. We are also going to have to focus on transmission investments from offshore wind off the Long Island Bight into Long Island in the city on a short time frame. All of these dynamics and components are creating reliability margin concerns, not just in New York City where we might expect it, but across upstate New York as well. What's a reliability margin? In short, and put simply, this is additional megawatts built into the system that have been there for years for unforeseen circumstances, almost like an insurance policy to serve reliability and demand needs. And that margin is beginning to shrink, as I mentioned, in New York City, pursuant to the retirement of certain peaker plants, but also across upstate New York. And unless we see investment in the system on the scheduled basis going forward, we could find ourselves in what we call a reliability violation in the next few years. Trying to avoid that, it's our job to study the system and to find if that reliability violation is present, beginning to reveal itself. If it is, it's our obligation to call that out and then to call for solutions. So we're, as I mentioned, watching this very carefully, and we'll continue to communicate to the public and lawmakers and policymakers on what we're seeing there. Lastly, we are seeing in our interconnection queue, these are renewable projects beginning to line up, wishing to connect to the system that have to go through reliability studies, primarily consisting of intermittent and limited duration resources. It's another cause for attention. And we do have a line of sight on what we believe is going to be necessary to build out a reliable system, the investments necessary. We could talk a little bit about that later in this event, but we're going to, in short, have to build more, almost 2-to-1 renewable resources to make up for the loss of the traditional thermal generation. So when we look at the interconnection queue and our investment needs, we certainly have challenges ahead. And then, of course, there are questions and uncertainties, things that we cannot predict, like increasing extreme weather. We saw the system perform very well over the holiday deep freeze, but that kind of anomalous weather is something that is difficult to plan for, but challenges us from a reliability perspective going forward. The more renewable intermittent generation on the system, the more difficult it can be in those situations where we have that extreme weather to keep the system reliable. Again, we could talk about this later on in the webinar, but in short, our reliability studies have shown that to reach the 2030 and the 2040 mandates under the CLCPA, it's very likely that we're going to have to maintain at least 17,000 megawatts of traditional thermal generation as a backup to the intermittent system that we're expecting. I'll pause there and hand it back over, and happy to go into more details as we go along. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Next up is Gavin Donahue of the Independent Power Producers of New York, or IPNY. His organization represents high power generation in New York. They include power plants that use a variety of electric generating technologies. These include hydro, nuclear, wind, oil, natural gas, waste to energy, and biomass. Gavin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Peter. I first of all, thank everybody for the opportunity to be here today. Little background about myself. Before I was in this job, I've been in this job now for 20 plus years at IPNY. I did 10 years at DEC in the 90s as executive deputy commissioner and was very involved in clean air issues there. And as part of that background, we have worked very hard in the last 20 years and in the 90s to reduce carbon in the electricity sector by 55% and NOx and SOx by 90% and 88%. What we're talking about today is a very important subject, and the folks that I represent support this clean energy transition, but they support a smart transition. And I think the issues that Kevin talked about this morning are really important because at the end of the day, it's about reliability. In addition to what Peter just laid out about what we do here at IPNY, a big issue that I think is really important, we employ somewhere around between 10 and 12,000 people across the state. And we also pay $1.5 to $1.7 billion in property taxes every year across the state. And I'm really proud of the environmental strides we've made in New York State and where we are from a reliability standpoint, because we have challenges and obstacles, but we have, I think, the most reliable electricity grid in the state, and a large credit of that goes to the ISO and all the market participants. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is the thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is I was a member of the Climate Council. I was appointed to the council. I spent over 2 years in all the meetings. I'm going to talk in a minute why I voted no on the plan, but just so folks understand what we're dealing with today. Upstate New York, roughly half of upstate New York is on renewable energy. Kevin mentioned the amount of hydro we have and nuclear resources. So we really have what I would say 90+% of upstate New York is emissions free. The problem becomes downstate, where we are 80% and higher of dual fuel on oil and gas every day to keep the lights on. And we need to build a lot of different new resources and new technologies to meet those goals. And Kevin laid out some of the numbers and how large of a build out we're going to have. The thing that I am concerned about in New York State is dispatchable resources and emission-free resources. If we're going to in 2040 have zero emissions, what technology is going to replace the fossil fuels in New York State to keep the lights on? I've used the term magic. Do I think 70 by 30 is attainable? It is, if everything goes right. Everything that's on the table is built on time, which is a question mark as to whether that would happen. But when you go from 30 to 40 and you have to attract those resources, keep the lights on, what is it going to be? Is it hydrogen? Is it renewable natural gas? New York State has failed to address that. And that is a big problem everybody needs to be concerned about, because in my mind and many other people's minds, and I know it is in John's, it's magic today. Why I voted against the plan is a couple of things that I think is important for folks to know. Not in any particular order, but this plan is written in a way that's all about bans. We're going to ban this, we're going to moratorium on that. It's command and control. It's not what can we attract to try to comply with these new resources. So there's a theme in this plan that I think is very negative. It's all about banning natural gas appliances and things like that. The other thing that I think is really important that this plan does not address is the public has no idea that this even went on, I don't think. We've had public meetings, but I don't think everyday folks know what the requirements of this law are and what it's going to take to get there. So there's been a lack of, in my mind, education, affordability. There is no analysis in this process. I spent 2 years with other members of the council and outside groups, 64 other statewide groups asking for a consumer impact analysis on this law. None of that has occurred. Estimates by NYSERDA are in upstate New York to retrofit a house to comply with this law is somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000. Massive amount of money for folks, but no analysis by the state about what that is and how it's going to be paid for. The next thing is there's a tremendous amount of undefined terms in the plan. One of them is fossil natural gas. Natural gas is the regulated term under law we should be using, and that isn't. But I'm going to go back to dispatchable resources because this is something John Murphy and I worked on. We have a petition with labor in front of the Public Service Commission to determine those zero emission resources. And for me, the fact that we have not moved on that issue, the plan talks about words around reliability, but they don't do anything to talk about what that actually takes to keep the lights on. So the fact that we do not have what we call in our world DFRs, zero emission resources, keep those lights on, it's a real problem. The other thing I'd like to point out is that labor and business have come together over this. We have signed up 7 different principles. You can access the principles document on various websites. But what I want to point out to this crowd, this is a set of principles that are formulated by IPNY, New York State Business Council, New York State Building Trades, and the AFL-CIO. And for folks that follow this business, you will know that putting labor and business on such an important document is really quite a feat, and quite frankly, something should be folks should be following. I'm going to end with the Cap and Invest program. And another thing that's important to John Murphy, which I know he'll talk about, but is worker training. Nothing in this plan, in my mind, gets to the point of where we're going to have adequate workers trained to run the new resources of the future. We need to do more as a state on the labor side. But Cap and Invest is the near-term issue that I think everybody should be focused on. We have been huge supporters of carbon pricing at the ISO. We believe an economy-wide approach, putting a price on carbon, is the best way to attain these goals. The governor's announced that DEC is going to pursue this Cap and Invest program. There's more unanswered questions than answered questions because this is going to be a tax on everybody in New York to pay for the next round of investments in the state. So with that, I hit a lot of subjects. I'll stop there, and hopefully I was within the time limit. Pretty fast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for saving me. I'd like to mention that you did serve on the New York State Climate Action Council. So sorry about that. And thank you for mentioning it. Next up, we have Jay Egg. He is the president of Egg Bio. His firm is a leader in geothermal energy systems. They help clients optimize their capabilities to generate effective heating and cooling systems using clean and sustainable energy. Okay.
Can you hear me okay now? Good. My name is Jay Egg, and I really appreciate the introduction, Peter. I'm going to talk a little bit about a different type of distributed energy that I know that John and the whole team here are understanding very well. They're called thermal energy networks, and the diagram you see on the screen was created for the New York City Council back about 10 years ago because they needed to understand how it was they were going to, how they were expected to decarbonize or electrify 900,000 of New York City's 1.1 million buildings. Right away, they recognized there's a problem with doing it all with appliance type air conditioners, air source air conditioners. And they wanted to see a little bit about what we had been doing for the last 30 years, and that is distributed energy in campuses. This image here kind of shares a little bit better what we're trying to talk about. And I really appreciate some of Kevin's comments. He talked about all of the data centers coming together, all of the different electrical increases we're seeing with needs for things as we electrify buildings. What we want to point out in this few minutes here is that data centers have something that normally gets put out through cooling towers on the roof. And with a thermal energy network, which this is something that has been in practice for more, like I said, more than 30, 40 years in cities throughout the world, you can take the energy from cooling dominant or data type buildings, pull it into process recovery operations and pump that thermal energy into apartments and single family homes and other folks that need that. In addition to that, as you look at the infrastructure in an urban environment, you have a lot of opportunities to move energy around through these thermal energy networks, including one of the things that we're not going to cover a lot today, but wastewater energy. In other words, we pay to heat a tremendous amount of hot water for drinking, for bathing, for cooking, for washing, whatever. And that hot water is being tapped for energy recovery and can provide all of it. You can actually recover enough energy from wastewater to provide heating for all of your domestic hot water needs in a typical urban environment. In addition to that, we're going to talk a little bit about how hydrogen and other fossil fuels play a part in a thermal energy network. And it's a really brilliant solution. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the technology in what we call a thermal energy network. And that is, it's called a 5th generation energy network, and it uses heat pumps, but it uses a different type of heat pump. But before we can talk about an air source versus a geothermal heat pump, we have to understand what a heat pump is. And a heat pump, for all intents and purposes, is exactly a refrigerator. A refrigerator pumps heat out of the box onto the floor where your feet can feel it, the same way an air conditioner pumps heat out of a building to the outside. The difference is heat pumps take heat from the outside air and pump it into the building, exactly the opposite of what a refrigerator or an air conditioner do. And they do that using an outside condenser. We're all familiar with these, and these are made low temperature where they can extract heat even below freezing and pump it into the building. The difference is the temperature outside is cold in the winter and hot in the summer, where with a geothermal or a water source heat pump, you can tap into the 55-degree constant temperature of the earth. So what you get out of that is 1 kilowatt, and this really speaks to this crowd. 1 kilowatt of energy sent through a space heater or an electric resistance perimeter induction heater gives you 3,412 BTUs of heat. But that same kilowatt of energy given from the grid to a geothermal heat pump will give you 17,000 BTUs of heat. That can really save us, and I'll show you why in this next slide. This is an example, and there are literally dozens of white papers and DOE peer-reviewed examples of this throughout the world. This is from Atlanta. This is the ASHRAE headquarters, where in 2010, they put air source heat pumps on the first floor and geothermal heat pumps on the second floor. Now, if you look at these months, you'll see that in January, February, March, October, November, December, why are the air source heat pumps using so much more demand for electricity per square foot than the geothermal? The answer is simple. It's simple heat transfer and fluid flow. The ground is 55 or more degrees year round, so you have an incredibly improved performance. Now, I want you to pay attention to one more thing. This summertime peak here for the heat pumps, if you look at the geothermal, the wintertime peak doesn't even hit summertime. That means we've solved a wintertime peaking problem with all electric. If we upgrade all of our buildings to a thermal energy network, it means whatever our summer peak is, our winter peak could theoretically be at or below that and levelize the grid, as you can see here. Another great example, just to show you just another one, 2 identical buildings built in Oklahoma. This is the wintertime peak here, and you can see the geothermal in green is flatlined, using about the same amount of energy all year, while the wintertime peak goes dramatically wonky for the air source heat pumps. Now, why is this so brilliant for a thermal energy network? I had the privilege of taking John Murphy and about 10 of his business leaders from different locals through this particular installation as we toured several different projects last year in February. And this one was particularly interesting because there are 15 22-story buildings at the Penn South Cooperative Apartment Complex in Manhattan that provide apartments for 2,500 New Yorkers and 25 New Yorker families. They have a 4 megawatt thermal energy load that they distribute from a boiler from this central energy plant that covers these 5 blocks worth of buildings. So NYSERDA asked AgGeo, how can we turn off this boiler and decarbonize these buildings? Well, we did some spatial and GIS analysis with our scientists, and we put together a proposal that showed where the post office, the US Postal Service across the street, has an 8 megawatt thermal energy rejection through their cooling towers. So we got them to buy into it. We got NYSERDA to buy into it, and a whole lot more I don't have time to talk about. But if we can pipe that 8 megawatts of thermal energy over to this energy plant here, we can turn off that boiler. How about that? We have just decarbonized 2,500 families in Midtown Manhattan by simply piping infrastructure. That's the beauty of this thing. Here's the other thing. If we continue the process of putting in air source heat pumps, appliance grade heat pumps willy-nilly, this handsome looking, this is a Manhattan apartment building here in the middle in this beige, this handsome looking thing is going to turn into a miserable third world wreck because it's not highly regulated and because it's just a lot of appliances hanging from buildings. It's not safe. It's not sustainable. What is sustainable is putting in thermal energy networks. And when we need extra energy in the form of heat, we can run that energy through hydrogen and natural gas CHP plants that then distribute when that energy is needed. It can be burned in these exchange facilities, boost the temperature of the thermal energy network, and provide thermal energy in a hydronic pipeline. Think about the Con Ed steam. This is even better. This is hydronic. This is what we call thermal energy networks at an ambient temperature, somewhere between 40 and 80 degrees is always running through. Some buildings are rejecting heat to it. Some buildings are absorbing heat from it. Our exchange facilities and surface water facilities normal that out. This is not, and I'm over my time, so I'm going to finish with this. This is not just something that's a wild idea. NYSERDA has funded incredible strides. Universities such as this one in Long Island have extensive feasibility studies showing how we are going to network all of these buildings together thermally and provide the answers that we need to help decarbonize New York, our New York citizens. And that's the end of my presentation.
That's great, Jake. Thanks so much. Let's go back to John Murphy for a moment before we begin our questions and further discussion. John, can you give us an update on what the coalition has been doing as the state's energy policy takes shape?
John, you're muted.
That time back, I first want to commend the previous speakers for their comprehensive presentations. It's important to see clear, unbiased data that is not driven by emotions or ideology, but by facts. We heard from the grid experts, more is more. More demand for electricity means more supply will be needed. More electric vehicles means more supply will be needed. More demand simply means we must generate more electricity. The good news is that it also means more clean energy jobs will be needed to make it all happen. This is good for the economy, good for workers, and good for the environment. In order to move more workers in the same direction, the challenge for many in my industry was to change the narrative from renewable to clean, from electrification to decarbonization. The end result is the same, but the words have different meanings to workers in the fossil fuel industry. In order for this state to achieve its goal of zero carbon emissions by 2040, while maintaining reliable and affordable energy for New Yorkers, a sensible, all of the above transition plan is needed. Critical energy demand must be met while all viable alternative clean sources are developed. Intermittent renewables can't do it alone. Based on the information shared today, assuming the most optimistic, favorable projections for expanding wind, solar, and other renewables, New York must build out a massive amount of clean energy in record time. And even if production of wind and solar power is maximized, it will never be enough to keep the lights on and power flowing. Specifically, according to NYISO projections, which the Climate Action Council fully acknowledges, some 45 gigawatts of dispatchable carbon-free power or alternative clean sources must be developed by 2040 to meet future electricity demand. The need for so much clean capacity is largely due to the inherent, indisputable major limitations of renewable sources alone. Thanks to President Biden, Majority Leader Schumer, and Governor Hochul, New York State will be the recipient of a number of massive transformational semiconductor and lithium-ion battery projects that will uplift our communities for multiple generations. The largest such project in North America, Micron, will begin construction on their chip fab project in central New York in late 2023. Micron anticipates a $100 billion investment over the next 20 years. The project will employ thousands of building trades union members under a project labor agreement. Now keep in mind, this is one project. The energy and electricity consumption from this one project will be equivalent to the electricity consumption of the entire state of Vermont. We cannot allow that project to stall. Building, maintaining, and retrofitting power generating facilities have continued to produce tens of thousands of high-paying union jobs in this state for more than half a century. Since the closing of Indian Point, which was a zero emissions facility, more than 1,000 permanent jobs were lost. With the denial of permits for NRG and Danskammer retrofit projects, more than 1,200 building trades jobs were lost for over 3 years. The narrow focus on renewables only will displace thousands of middle-class jobs in New York. Now, experts agree that in order to move away from fossil fuel power generation, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen have to be in the mix. A hydrogen hub in the Northeast will create thousands of high-paying building trades jobs. New York State also needs to support and enhance its nuclear power generation with clear written support for the relicense of upstate nuclear. In order to meet the goal of zero emissions by 2040 while supplying affordable energy to ratepayers, New York needs to create a funding mechanism to establish a new competitive program or tier under the Clean Energy Standard to encourage the development of zero-emitting electric generating facilities that are not renewable energy systems as defined in the CLCPA. Another key focus on decarbonizing our state is in the building sector. As Jay Egg illustrated, ground source heat pumps are extremely efficient and do not tax the electric grid during peak heating and cooling seasons. Thermal energy networks would also allow for building decarbonization at scale while preserving and creating high-paying union jobs and allow for a true transition for the very workers that install and maintain fossil fuel heating and cooling piping and equipment. Now, I applaud Governor Hochul and the New York State Legislature for the passage of the Utility Thermal Energy Network and Jobs Act. But using the Upgrade New York model, New York State now needs to invest in detailed design to get 15 high-emitting SUNY campuses and facilities shovel-ready for thermal energy networks by 2025. Eliminating on-site emissions from 15 of the highest emitting state-owned facilities would reduce on-site energy use 40% overall from state facilities. These are real solutions that provide clean, reliable energy and will sustain and create thousands of middle-class union jobs built by New Yorkers. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Let's start with some questions. Evan, I'm going to start with you, and after you answer, if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. You talked a lot about reliability, so a couple of things. First of all, does that mean New York will be facing rolling blackouts at some point? And secondly, how much of a challenge is it going to be to fill that gap so we don't face those problems?
Let's take the first question straight away. I appreciate it. So if we do our job correctly, we will not be facing rolling brownouts. We, as I mentioned, keeping very close watch on all the changes in the system across the state. And when we do see a reliability need that reveals itself through our studies, we have a tariff by force of law driven obligation responsibility to raise our hand and say, there's a reliability need on this system. We see it years away, maybe it's 2 years away, but we raise our hand and say, we see that reliability issue. We need to solve that now, and we call for solutions. That is part of the process to avoid what we've seen in other parts of the country, like in Texas or California, disturbances on the system as they've gone through their transition. In terms of what's going to be necessary from an investment and an infrastructure point of view, I'm just going to quickly share another screen and another slide here on my screen, and it'll put some numbers to the massive expectation that we see. So we have roughly 37,400 gigawatts of capacity in the system today. That of course doesn't account for the availability of imports and other sources, but that's roughly what we have in the system today. If I look at my screen in my office, we're running about, the demand today is actually pretty low, 16,281 megawatts at the moment. Of that, we've got a fair amount of wind today. We don't usually see it this high, about 1,300 megawatts of wind. But the clear majority of those 16,200 megawatts are being served by nuclear, which is about 3,200 megawatts, hydro, which is about 2,500 megawatts, and other fossil fuel, which makes up about 5,000 megawatts. So that's gives you a picture of how we serve our needs today. To meet the 2030 goal and keep the system reliable and account for the divestitures of machines we know are getting ready to leave the system, we're going to have to develop at least another 20 gigawatts in the next 7 years of renewables to meet the goal, keep the system reliable. And when we contemplate the 2040 goal, we're looking at a massive amount of new resources, plus traditional resources to serve, as I mentioned earlier, some of those situations where we can't rely on intermittent generation. So that's a 3x increase from today. That gives us and again, these are these are conclusions we've reached through these reliability studies. We run several models through sophisticated software, using all this data that we can find from various different resources to come to these determinations.
Does anybody else want to jump in here and take a shot at this?
I just would like to jump in and just add one thing that I think is important for the audience. Keep in mind what Kevin just laid out here number-wise. 1 gigawatt is 750,000 homes. So that is a massive amount of electricity generation. Just so folks can follow that on the web, I thought that would be important to state.
Okay.
And-
Gavin, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. If you guys remember the simple Manhattan example, we had 4 megawatts needed for 2,500 families, which probably falls right in line with what Gavin and Kevin were talking about. Meanwhile, remember, you have so much, part of the reason we have so much of an increase in electrical consumption is electrification itself, but the data centers, the cloud, the chip manufacturers. We can use the unions to harvest that thermal energy and distribute it. It actually, like we showed, it takes 1/3 the electricity to heat a building through a thermal energy network than it does just by electric resistance or even cold climate heat pumps. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Kevin, I'm going to throw the next question to you. We're talking about the need to build these various types of plants. What is the challenge in actually getting them built? And what are the types of plants that you're talking about?
Yeah, appreciate that question too. So if folks aren't aware, every major transmission or generation project that seeks to connect to the system needs to go through a process where we analyze the project from a reliability point of view. So we look at these proposals individually, make sure they can do what they purport to do. And then when we have a group of projects that want to connect to the system within similar time frame, we look at all those projects together as they connect to the system and see how they will interact and what impacts they might have on the system. And then if there are necessary upgrades to keep the system reliable, for instance, expanding a substation, or actually maybe even moving interconnection points because the system's more reliable, if that happens, we assign those costs to the developer to make sure they're not assigned to the consumer. It's a lengthy process. We're looking for ways to make it more efficient. And we understand the pressures we're all under. We work with the utilities to run that process, as well as local governments to make sure it's efficient in order to help meet the CLCPA goals and transform the system. When we look at that what we call an interconnection queue, and all those projects that are lining up, the clear majority of them are batteries, wind projects, and solar projects. So we are looking at almost exclusively, there's transmission projects in there as well, but we're looking at almost exclusively intermittent renewable technology. So we're working hard at moving those projects through our process. We understand the economy also can throw us curveballs and is having an impact on developers getting financing, supply chain issues. And those are things that are way beyond our control, but we also need to track and keep our eye on, because that makes the process and the landscape that much more challenging.
Peter, if I could jump in and touch on something that Gavin had mentioned before about union training funds and training programs. From a power generation perspective and looking at jobs created, nuclear facilities are by far the largest job creator, not only on the build out, but on the constant maintenance. These are multi-generational jobs that keep entire towns alive. The least job creator would be the solar industry. Solar industry installers typically make between 30 and 40% of what a building trades union member makes, and there's little to no maintenance on those facilities at all. So that's when we look at a jobs perspective. From building decarbonization, thermal energy networks will be a tremendous job creator and will require maintenance and allow utility workers to transition to maintain thermal energy networks while making it more efficient for those buildings as well. So it's an important perspective to realize as we look at our energy goals, it's important to understand the impact to the workers that make their living in those industries.
Gavin, you want to take a shot at this as well, just in terms of the challenges in getting these plants built and what this would mean for your people?
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, building anything in New York is complicated. And there is no matter whether it's a wind farm or a gas plant, somebody's going to be opposed to it. So it's complicated. To get to what Kevin talked about earlier about interconnection, that's a complicated process, takes a long time. But when you look at building infrastructure, energy infrastructure, regardless of what it is, it's a 7 to 10 year process by the time you start and get permits, financing, build, and get connected. So it's complicated and it's a challenge. And that's why I think you hear a theme of folks being skeptical about reaching these goals, because it's a huge challenge. What I think I would add to this that folks, I think Jay touched on it, but when you look at carbon emissions, according to DEC, 13% of the carbon emissions come from the electricity sector in New York. The rest, lion's share of it, is 32% from buildings and 28% from transportation, and 10% from manufacturing. We need to figure out how to deal with buildings in a cost-effective way, how to deal with the challenge Jay talked about across New York State, which is really complicated, and how do we build out the transportation sector in a way that makes sense on an EV standard. So those are I see the big challenges. And the problem with the law that was passed, there's no funding sources in that law. Yeah, NYSERDA has programs and things like that, but there is nothing in the law that shows us how to pay for this as consumers. So those are some of the challenges.
Hey, let me throw this question at you. I know you talked about this in your presentation, but just to be clear on this, how much geothermal will be used to bridge the gap? And we're talking about the time frame here. Realistically, how quickly can you get built out?
That's a great question. Appreciate that. Peter, I've been at this for 35 years. I see it as a 30-year track to get the lion's share of these built out. And I'll use an example. I love stories, and this story is at the beginning of World War II. Our oil that was in Texas needed to get up to New York harbors for ships and manufacturing. And right in the first month of World War II, 73 of our ships were sunk off the coast of Florida. So the U.S. commissioned 2 pipelines from Texas to New York and completed them in 355 days. Using that learned technology, we in the U.S. energy utilities installed 1.5 million miles of natural gas lines to connect 70 million customers. This is what American tradesmen do. They put in infrastructure, and essentially the infrastructure is exactly the same as, and I'll show you right here, it's exactly the same as natural gas. I'm not saying but if you look at the fact that you got a pipe in the ground with a natural gas system, if you're doing a thermal energy network, we're going to end up with 2 things out of this. The fact of the matter is we need to mirror what's already in the ground for our natural gas distribution system, except it's going to be carrying water and thermal energy now. And I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, look, 2030 is right around the corner. And we're talking about Your tout 7 to 10 years and other years that we've heard. I'll open this to the field. We need to keep fossil fuels as a backup, or maybe how important is it? And can we do it without keeping these fossil fuel plants open? Anybody want to take a shot?
I'll give a recent example of why, and I mentioned before, the studies that we performed. Right now, it shows that we're not able to operate a system in the future without what seems like a significant level of the traditional system in place as a backbone. So if we look at what got us through the holiday deep freeze, it really was an example of how that backup power is going to be necessary for extreme weather that we can't predict. So in the city, there's a requirement that the plants in the city can burn either oil or natural gas. They're called dual fuel capability plants. And there was an awful constraint regionally on the natural gas system in the Northeast and New England over that holiday deep freeze, but we were very reliable here in New York. There were pockets of concern. We were generally concerned as we were in the control room watching the system, of course. But there were pockets of acute reliability concerns to our south and to our northeast in New England that we weren't experiencing here because that fleet of plants could switch from natural gas over to oil. So how to account for that going forward? Because again, that's what pulled us through. We saw consumer appeals being issued in PJM where wellheads were freezing and power plants were not able to get the gas that they needed to run and serve the system. But here, because of that backup oil and that dual fuel capability, we had a very reliable system. We didn't have the same kinds of concerns.
John, what would this mean for your people and what's your feeling about this?
Peter, who was that directed
To you, John.
So, to touch on what Kevin said, if we're thinking about the necessary backup needed, why wouldn't we clean up these dirty, polluting plants to have them ready to go and in turn create thousands of really good union jobs? It just makes sense to do that, especially if it's only as a backup. NRG and Danskammer were two of those examples that were shovel ready to be able to do it and only needed when backup was required.
I just want to emphasize something Kevin Lanahan said. Dual fuel capability in New York City is the #1 blessing we have as a state, because from a reliability standpoint, if we weren't able to switch, we would have huge problems across this, in New York City in particular. But at the end of the day, the lights are going to stay on, and the theory of some of these advocates that we have to oppose all combustion is bad, is just wrong, because we need to keep the lights on. We need to do what John talked about, employ people. And at the same time, we need to address what I think are hugely legitimate environmental justice issues. But just saying no to any sort of combustion as a way to do it is impractical and, quite frankly, a disservice to the people you say you're trying to help. So that's a point I'd like to make here today before we close. Thanks.
Let's have a few minutes left. Jay, I do have a question for you. I understood your very clear explanation of geothermal. But I am curious, does geothermal either take from the grid or add to the grid, or is it neutral? It feeds these various buildings.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, and it makes sense to just have this up for a second to understand it. And I'm going to jump to this one if I do it right. Okay, so this is all about heating and cooling in hot water. So because it takes 1/3 the energy to heat a building with a heat pump using a thermal energy network, if we use this is kind of like replacing an old steam system or an old campus loop. But the real fact of the matter is that you can do, even if there is not balance, like the data centers are dumping heat into apartments. Say it's summertime and everybody's creating heat. That's normally our peak electrical season, is the middle of July or August. Well, all that extra energy then gets dumped into the sewers, gets dumped into the surface water, or goes out through cooling towers. That's all part of the master planning of these cities. But this is a completely moving of BTUs, not electrical energy. This is all BTU energy. We're just using waste energy from data centers and cooling dominant buildings, CHP, combined heat and power plants, like these generation facilities you see. I love this example that I did for a hydrogen group not too long ago, and it's right. I'm just trying to find where it is here so I can share it with everybody. There's I'm on the wrong, can't find it, but the extra energy is provided through burning of either hydrogen or natural gas to create electricity and waste energy in these energy exchange facilities. So it is very, very important to realize that it's a very symbiotic relationship. I hope that makes sense. You are muted still, Peter.
Thank you. So it seems like you're basically reducing the demand on the grid. Is that the critical piece? Now you're muted, Jay.
Yes, at a snapshot today, if everybody was on all electric heat pumps, if we had thermal energy networks, theoretically, and our scientists and models prove it, we could operate with the electricity capacity we have today. We know that things are going to change a lot, though, over the years. So we're here to be there with that change.
Great, thank you. John, I want to get back to something that one of our viewers is curious about. The NRG project, why did that get turned down?
I understand, and I think Gavin may be able to confirm that it didn't comply with the terms of the CLCPA. So I think it was the air quality permits, but that was a job that would have put more than 600 building trades members to work for more than 3 years. Now, with some unemployment in the locals, members have had to find work out of state, because a building trades member, unlike someone who works permanently on a power plant, a building trades member could work for multiple employers within any year. And if they're not on the job, they're hourly workers, they don't get paid. So in order to not only feed their families, but to maintain medical coverage and pension credit, often they have to seek work in other states to maintain that. And that's exactly what took place over the last year and a half in New York City.
Jay, we have a viewer question for you. Is it possible to use existing water utility lines as a heat source for some heat pumps without disrupting water service?
Yes, it is. We're working at the national level with the DOE on projects using, we call it drinking water energy, and there is an opportunity to supplement our thermal energy network significantly with that, and that will put more pipe trades to work too.
Great, gentlemen, thank you all so much for your time. That's about all the time we have today. John Murphy, Kevin Lanahan, Gavin Donahue, Jay, thank all of you for being with us and giving us the insight on supply needs as the state seeks to transition to a cleaner energy future. We plan to continue these discussions with other guests in the coming weeks and months, where we hope to dive into more topics related to clean energy. For all of you watching us today, thank you for joining us. Have a great day and a great week. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.